But first, many years ago, I was invited to speak at a conference in China, along with several other Australian advertising creatives, meaning the people who actually write the ads as opposed to all the suits who wander around taking the glory. The purpose of the three-day conference was to teach this massive auditorium of around 1,000 kids who were all up-and-coming Chinese media students about how to communicate in a creative fashion, how to use creative ideas to get your message across most effectively. The topic I was given for my 20-minute speech was how to use humour as an effective marketing tool. I was even interviewed afterwards on Chinese television about how to be funny. I have a sneaking suspicion I failed abysmally. The fake tweet of the Australian soldier slitting the throat of a child was definitely not funny and, as Scott Morrison pointed out, clearly repugnant. But it was devastatingly effective. And I couldn't help but think about that conference this week. Thousands of eager young Chinese students desperately jotting down their notes about how to most effectively cut through all the media clutter to get your message across to the world, to as wide an audience as possible, in as short a time as possible. When news of the tweet and Morrison's response to the tweet, and then the Chinese response to Morrison's response to the tweet, made headlines not only around the world, but even in Australia's advertising trade magazines, I couldn't help wondering for a moment if Zhao Lijiang, the Foreign Ministry spokesperson responsible for that image, hadn't been one of those students back all those years ago. In terms of the creativity of his repugnant image, as a creative director, I would have to say its execution was sloppy and the idea was in appalling taste and reminded me of the sort of clunky ideas that the most ham-fisted junior creatives come up with. But the image and the timing and the delivery were remarkably effective. As I write in this week's Spectator Australia, no matter how ugly, factually incorrect and obscene Zhao's doctored image may be, its potency lies in its perceived credibility, and that credibility was handed over on a plate by Prime Minister Scott Morrison and General Angus Campbell, when first they announced the tabling of the, quote, brutal truths within the Brereton Report, followed by announcing collective punishment for anyone remotely close to the alleged atrocities, and in a final obscenity, the preemptive stripping, which has now been reversed, of citations from, among others, dead soldiers. As I say in The Spectator Australia, you reap what you sow, and the fact that our government and military leadership went out of their way to not only broadcast but seemingly verify the unproven allegations to the world has now given licence to our many foes to misuse this information as propaganda at will, which is precisely what they are doing and they will carry on doing. The word allegation probably doesn't even have a translation in Xi's China. And of course, if or when any or even all of these accused soldiers are found in a court of law not to have committed the alleged crimes at some point down the track, you can guarantee Zhao won't be rushing out any creative tweets proclaiming their innocence. Here's another attempt at Chinese humour, this one also this week from the Global Times, the newspaper in English that is basically a mouthpiece for the communist government. Again, fairly unsubtle, not desperately original, and certainly not particularly funny, which is a grave sin for any cartoonist, but at least it wasn't offensive. It was the cartoon accompanying a story that I was particularly delighted to read, and one that hardly got any media coverage here in Australia, or not enough, and that, of course, was the passing in the lower house of the government's Foreign Relations Bill, which we talked about earlier, which is designed to allow the federal government to veto any agreements struck by state governments, local councils, or entities such as universities with foreign governments, meaning, of course, the Chinese. It is now reported that Each Way Albo may now block the bill in the Senate. Well, that would be a stupid move. But the Global Times was quick off the mark to get its cartoon out and then to lecture Australia, to lecture us about our bill, saying, and I quote from the article, "Australia now seems to be in an abnormal state of political madness and paranoia, with a distorted mindset confusing what is right and what is wrong. Remember, this is the mouthpiece of the Chinese government. The fact that the legislation could be passed in the parliament shows that anti-China forces in Australian political circles are gaining the momentum. Political prejudices are coming first, overwhelming their consideration for actual interests. This will inevitably undermine Australia's economic interests. Okay, a bit of a threat there. And as I said, this is the official mouthpiece of the Chinese government. They then say, interestingly, the bill is widely viewed as a response to Australia's southeast Victoria state signing a memorandum of understanding with China on the China-proposed Belt and Road Initiative in 2018. Cooperation between an Australian state and China under the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative is something the Morrison administration certainly frowns upon. Analysts expect this bill could be used to crack down on dealings with China. And then finally, they also say this: Victoria is still proactively cooperating with China, even after US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warned in May that the US could disconnect from Australia over Victoria's Belt and Road deal. Outsiders fans will, of course, remember that Mike Pompeo's comments about the USA disconnecting from Victoria were made exclusively to me in an interview on this show, Outsiders. Indeed, at the time, The Guardian, the ABC, and plenty of the mainstream media all piled in and ridiculed the fact that the interview was on this show, labeling us as some kind of fringe, weirdo, freako show. And the media all said that the comments were crude, ill-informed and bad for the health of Australia's US alliance, and that the interview, they claimed, had been a diplomatic disaster. Really? Fast forward 6 months and now a bill that could end, or should I say disconnect, Victoria from that insidious Belt and Road program and end the overt propaganda within our universities and elsewhere has passed the reps and is poised to pass through the Senate. Well, in my opinion, the only real disaster will be, well, for Ichwe Albo if he fails to pass the bill in the Senate. More importantly, after the bill eventually does pass, for those universities, councils and state governments that have sold this country out by greedily taking communist Chinese money by the bucket load and in doing so compromised potentially our national security. So, chalk it up as another win for the Outsiders. And by that, I don't just mean us here on the show, I mean you at home who are watching us. Give yourselves a well-earned pat on the back.